Ambassador Volker, welcome to the border zone again.
Thank you.
You were with us a year ago, and thank you for coming to Georgia again. I would like to start our interview with, I wear this shirt for a reason. On the back, it's written that 20% of Georgia is occupied by Kremlin. And as I know, you visited occupied territories a few times.
To the boundary.
The boundary, yeah. And at the moment, we see Russian forces, KGB, FSB forces, moving towards Georgia, 1 kilometer and 200 meters deeper in Georgia again. And I wanted to say this in this interview and ask you, they show that the West, the strategic partners of Georgia, are weak and they can't help Georgia to defend their territory, lives, future. What will be your answer for this?
Right. Well, first off, I think it's tremendously important that we keep raising the visibility of this issue. It's tremendously important for Georgia, but it's also tremendously important for Europe and the United States. We can't have a situation where an aggressor just keeps taking territory from another country. This needs much higher international visibility and ought to have some international dialogue around it. And getting back to the point where we are talking about the 2008 ceasefire and that Russia needs to do what it said it would do in 2008 to implement that ceasefire. And that's not happening at the moment. I know this has been on the radar of Secretary of State Pompeo. I had a chance to hear him talk about that. Philip Rieker, the acting Assistant Secretary for Europe, was with us at the boundary crossing point as well, sent here by Secretary Pompeo for the very purpose of trying to raise a little bit of American visibility and attention on this. But clearly more needs to happen.
Do you, in DC, not you, maybe you are here from time to time. In DC, people understand that it's ongoing aggression and boundaries are moving and people are dying from time to time and being kidnapped all the time, every week. Do they understand it in Washington?
I don't think so. I don't think people really realize just how live it is, if you will, how ongoing, how, as you say, people are abducted or captured, some have been killed or tortured, and there's a difficulty in crossing the boundary, for people who need it for their livelihood. It disrupts the lives of local people tremendously, and I don't think people fully understand that that's actually what's happening. And there, as you say, there are a few people who know because they visit Georgia, they know Georgia, but the vast majority don't, and I think it needs higher visibility.
Assistant Secretary Rieker yesterday, he stated, again, repeated the support of United States to Georgia, and et cetera, but why can't this support be expressed by, for example, sanctions list in regard with Georgia? We don't have it.
Yeah, that's a great question because we do have sanctions on Russia for a number of other reasons, to the point that people are beginning to wonder what other sanctions would make sense in general, because we've sanctioned Russia for a variety of reasons and also increasingly harsh sanctions. But I do think that this deserves greater visibility. And what I would argue is that more than sanctions per se, at least not initially, I would argue that we need a better format for focusing attention on Russia. Right now, this Geneva process that we have doesn't meet at a senior level. Russia does not engage in a serious way, and it's a process that doesn't actually get to the core of the issues. And I think we should be thinking about, are there ways we can get greater pressure, not just the U.S., but also France and Germany, European Union, which negotiated the ceasefire, that should have a stake.
Is it an interest of so-called joint West to support Georgia on the same level as Ukraine, for example? Because as we see, it's just statements all the time. And increasing of weapon or sanctions or something else. Sanctions is not about countering Russia's actions. Sanctions for Georgia could be one more a proof of understanding of what's going on in Georgia.
Well, the purpose of sanctions is to change the policy. That we'd like to see different behavior. We don't want to be in the position of sanctioning.
In the best world.
Right. We don't want to be sanctioning Russia, but we've got to do something to get Russia to change its behavior and what it's doing. And I agree with you. I think there should be as much international focus on the occupied territories in Georgia as there is in Ukraine. One of the reasons that it is a diminished level of attention is that it has been so long. It's been 11 years. And also because the level of violence, as bad as it is here, is far worse in the Donbass, where you have people killed on a weekly basis.
9 people were kidnapped in August on Georgian occupied territory. So it's aggression of the Kremlin, and of course, I would like to ask you, for example, when you come back to DC, to talk more
I will.
about this current
will.
situation here. Could you say, for example, yesterday, as I know, President Trump stated that he's ready to become a part of Ukrainian resolution process in regard with this change of prisoners from Ukraine and Russia. How do you evaluate this statement? And can we say that after this change, U.S.-Russia relations will be better or more positive?
Right. So first off, U.S.-Russia relations are at the lowest point in a very long time. And if you take any number of issues, we are in a negative column here, whether it's INF or the diplomatic missions or Russia and Syria or Iran or Venezuela or Ukraine or Georgia. So across the board, we have a negative relationship, which is unfortunate. This is not good for anybody, not good for the world. But it's driven by Russia's own behavior. What I think President Trump would like to do is to see improvements in that. And so he keeps holding open the door to talking with Russia and seeing if we can resolve things. But Russia's got to be willing to resolve them.
Don't you, because people do, don't you consider open doors, dialogue, trying to talk, and etc., when United States leaders, world leaders all the time say that Putin is terrorist, comparing with some, I don't know, bad guys in the world, saying that it's a criminal regime, and etc., and then you say about open doors with a criminal, as United States says.
But I don't agree with that, because we're talking about countries. This is a country that has a military. It's willing to use its military against its neighbors, as we see in Georgia. It's got nuclear weapons. It is disruptive in many parts of the world. We've got to be able to talk to them to see if we can stop that behavior. So I think it's important to keep that channel of dialogue.
Do you see during all of these years some effective tools to stop these actions? Because we see these actions again and again in Ukraine, in Georgia.
Right. No, I've actually seen Russian behavior get worse over the years.
Yeah. Will you agree that West is, for some reason, I don't know why, is weak against the Kremlin?
I think that the West is actually much stronger than Russia, that if you look at politically, economically, militarily, influence-wise, we have all the capacity on the side of the West, that Russia is relatively weak. What we don't have is the initiative of aggression. Russia is able to take initiative. They have an authoritarian system, a single ruler, and the ability to decide and act, whereas we have democratic systems that require rule of law, that require checks and balances, and democracies demand caution from their leadership rather than getting us sucked into things that publics don't want to be sucked into. So he has the advantage of initiative. That said, I think all of the strength is on the side of the West and time is on the side of the West. And that's also true in the case of Georgia and Ukraine. I think that as Georgia develops as a strong, healthy democracy, growing prosperity, growing security, growing relationships with the rest of the world, including Europe and NATO, that is a pole of attraction for the occupied territories. You don't have people in the occupied territories wishing that they were actually part of Russia. You have them wanting to see the boundaries removed. And I think that's an important fact, and same is true in Ukraine.
Yeah, my last question, I know that you're in a hurry. It will be like a bit tricky. So, for example, today on the conference, McCain conference in Tbilisi, you saw one of the pro-Kremlin party's leader, Ilminashvili, break through and try to spoil the conference and state something bad, and etc. You see the processes, I will connect it because of the time, you see the processes around the nuclear port. You see some other processes in Georgia, you will understand, I think, without me. You just said that Georgia is like trying to be a democratic country, and etc., etc. What would you maybe suggest to Georgian civil society, not the government, I think, as a way out from this corridor where we have problems with the nuclear, pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin, I would say, because I'm Russian, pro-Kremlin forces running around the city, and borderization, kidnappings. What should we do?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that I would recommend. One of them is transparency. Just shine a light on all these things so that it is clear what's happening. Second thing is be practical. So it's one thing to be emotional and angry and to call for things, but specifically, here is a solution as well. Come up with solutions. Like Anaklia is a good example where there is a private sector consortium that has tried to develop it. There is Russian efforts to try to stop it. There is government support for the project, but not as much as the consortium wants. There are other things going on in the background. But rather than finger pointing, it's more important to come up with what is a solution that will get this project completed. And I think that is what I would recommend also to civil society. About the conference, let me just also say that we welcome all ideas and all people to represent them, but we demand that people act with civility.
I would like you to mention the last thing. You know that Irma Ignashvili, leader of Alliance of Patriots, she came because of the statement of deputy head of NATO, Mr. Rasmussen, who said that Georgia should think about joining NATO without Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So it was the reason she came. You know this theory of Luke Coffey and other experts, not official experts, stating that the fifth article of the NATO alliance should could not be engaged in unoccupied territories. How would you just command this statement of Mr. Rasmussen, because it's a scandal now in Georgian media?
Well, let's be clear. He was the Secretary General of NATO, and he's retired. It's his own opinion. Secondly, what he is being asked about is concerns about whether Georgia or NATO would be expected to use military force to recover the occupied territories. Because Article 5 means collective defense, and you fight to protect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the members. What he said is that Georgians need to decide whether they think that Article 5 should apply to those occupied territories, meaning that there would have to be a conflict. And if Georgians don't want a conflict, then to say that Article 5 would not apply there. That's a choice for Georgians to make, not for anyone outside.
So he was not trying to interfere in Georgian politics?
No, just the opposite. He's trying to give Georgians an explanation that this is a choice Georgia would have to make. And if the Georgians decide that they're willing to say, don't apply Article 5 here, just for the rest of the country, then talk to NATO about that and see whether something can be arranged. From a NATO point of view, NATO does not want to be taking in territories that would require them to immediately enter into a conflict. But at the same time, you don't want to give a situation where you incentivize Russia to occupy countries' territory as a way of preventing them from realizing their own aspirations about being part of Europe. So you don't want to give that incentive to Russia either.
Thanks a lot for your time. Thank you for coming to Georgia and supporting Georgia all the time. And please say the words about the situation on occupied territories in Washington for people to know.
Thank you very much, Didi Madloba, and I will.
Okay. Thank you.